back. From North Carolina to Mississippi, the debate over LGBT rights and religious freedom is raging. And amidst the back and forth, interesting reaction from corporate America, which in many cases has come out strongly in favor of measures protecting gay, bi, and transgender people. A panel discussion follows here. Angela Peoples is with Get Equal. Terry Jeffrey is editor of CNSnews.com. Good of you both to come in. Thank you very much for your time. Interesting, Angela and Terry, to see in the wake of the Supreme Court decision of last summer on marriage, all of these fights coming up in the state capitals with bills ending up on governors' desks. And interesting, too, so you've got governors reacting in different ways, and you've got corporate America with a very strong voice in all this.
Sure. I think that this is not something that many of us in the LGBT community, particularly those that do a lot of work in advocacy and organizing, anticipated that this would be there would be a response like this after marriage equality became sort of legalized around the country through the Supreme Court ruling that we heard last summer. We anticipated that there would be a rise in a backlash, really is what you can call it. This is something that we see historically in America as rights are moved forward for different communities that have been marginalized and disenfranchised. There is a big blowback. We saw these bills percolating last year in states like Georgia. This is the second time that Georgia tried to pass a bill like this, and also the second time that the governor in Georgia vetoed the bill, or the bill was killed. But this is not something that was unanticipated, but I do think that's something that we're seeing in unprecedented ways.
And Terry, the bills vary widely. Some of them have to do with a person's gender identity and what bathroom they would use. In other cases, I think in the Mississippi one, it was whether a government employee at the local county or state level who has a personal religious opposition to some provision of law, whether they can rely upon their belief in basically nullifying the law, if you'll accept that description. So I don't pretend, as we discuss it here, that these are identical legislation. Yep. They're not, except that there's some element of LGBT or gender identity involved in each.
Well, I think the ultimate question here is not the one the court addressed in the Obergefell case, but it does follow from that. It's actually the same issue that the court heard oral arguments in the Zubik v. Burwell case 2 weeks ago, which addresses the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which a lot of these local laws are based on. But the ultimate question, I believe, is whether or not government in the United States of America can compel a Christian to act against their faith. And I think there's a very big distinction between, someone runs a restaurant and someone comes in and they happen to be of a particular sexual orientation. Most of the time people aren't even going to know that. And so the person serves that person. There's a difference between that and saying that the Little Sisters of the Poor must cover abortion-inducing drugs in their health care plan, or that a Baptist clergyman in Georgia must officiate over same-sex marriage, or whether the Knights of Columbus must provide their facility to be used for a same-sex marriage. That's the question. It's a matter of government compulsion of people to act against the Christian faith.
There's also, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a couple of things here, and we should be specific about the bill in Mississippi, particularly because the bill in Mississippi does, the language in terms of the governor's justification for signing the bill talked about specifically how it's a very narrow, the language is very narrow, and it's not a broad religious protection bill like some of the bills that we heard in last year's. But the reality is, it talks about protecting, giving people protection to not exercise a particular element of their job,
government function,
a government function, if there is a deeply held religious belief, but it's specific to marriage being between a man and a woman, and also that sex is reserved for people in marriages that are of one man and one woman. In addition to that, it also specifies that gender identity is something that is specific to anatomy in your gender, and it's also only male and female. And so I bring this point up because the Mississippi bill only protects people who have a deeply held religious belief that's rooted in Christianity, and only in this specific part about Christianity, which is a far overreach when you think about what our Constitution was based on. It says specifically that.
Well, look, I think I would say there's a second distinction, and I think from my point of view, it's a disturbing one if we have government in the United States of America, in some instances, will be a place where someone who's a sincerely believing Christian, who believes in moral principles that the Christian faith has held since Christ.
But do you believe
wait a minute, let me finish my thought. Cannot serve in government because the government will ask them to engage in an act that is contrary to the Christian faith. But let me give you a specific example of something that's going on now. With, for example, the case in the Supreme Court, the question is whether East Texas Baptist University should have, a Baptist university must have a health care plan compelled by the government that covers abortion-inducing drugs and devices. To me, that's a very fundamental question. Can the government tell a Christian institution or individual that you must be complicit in the taking of an innocent life?
I don't take away for a moment the issue you raised in terms of its importance and the rub between the various interests that exact situation represents. I'm talking, though, about North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, the issues that we've seen in recent time. And I guess what I'm thinking is, and maybe this is hypothetical, but I think it applies actually, if it's my job to handle permits when people want to build an addition on the back of their house, you all come before me and you say, we want to build an addition on the back of the house, and I'm like, I'm really not down with interracial couples. No. Is that cool? Is that what we want?
In Mississippi, the law doesn't say that, right? So it's important to note that this law in Mississippi is specifically targeting people who are in same-sex relationships or transgender people. So this is actually an even deeper level of discrimination and targeting than we've seen in other religious discrimination.
My understanding is that none of these laws say that. For example, HB 757, the Georgia law, in its final iteration, as I understand it, it did two things. One is that it specifically said that ministers and religious organizations could not be forced to do things against their faith. For example, a Baptist clergyman cannot be told, you must officiate a same-sex marriage. Or the Knights of Columbus, you must, in fact, use your facility for same-sex marriage. But it also essentially reflected the language of the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what the Religious Freedom Restoration Act says, the government can, in fact, compel someone to act against their sincerely held religious belief, provided it has a compelling government interest and does so in the least restrictive means. Now, personally, I think that's wrong. I don't think that the government should be able to say to a Christian, you must engage in this anti-Christian activity. But the law, in fact, would allow that.
As some define anti-Christian.
Well, right. And here's what's interesting. So the initial conversation about when the Federal Religious Freedom and Restoration Act was discussed was actually started as a conversation about a Muslim person who was facing discrimination on their job, right? And so my question to you is, do you actually think that it is we should be legislating, we should be writing laws that are specifically only protecting one religion out of all of the many? That's what these laws are saying.
No, it does not. No, actually, it does not.
The language is if you have it, but you said said you used the word Christian initially when you were talking about it.
But first of all, the law does not say Christian. First of all, the First Amendment.
Right, but the language in the law says marriage.
No, it does not.
It says if you have a.
No, it does not.
It says okay. Well, we can debate what the language is, but in Mississippi, my understanding is that it speaks to how marriage is if you can basically refuse to do some act of your job or refuse service or refuse if you have a deeply held belief that marriage is between a man and a woman and that sex is only preserved for people in marriages that are of marriage. Like this is a far reach.
That is not specifically Christian. First of all, the First Amendment to the United States.
Well, you use the language Christian.
Okay, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution would not have been ratified without the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Sure.
Okay, that's a basic principle of American law.
But there's a difference between prohibiting exercise of religion and discriminating based on that religion.
Now, let me point out to you a distinction. If someone says, my religion says that I can murder innocent people, my religion says that I must engage in abortion, I believe the government can say, I'm sorry, you're claiming that your religion allows you to deprive someone else of their fundamental right, you're going to take away their right to life. That is different. That is a legitimate role of government, from the government saying, look, we are going to force you. You're sitting there, you little sisters are sitting there in your convent, and you right now are not covering abortion-inducing drugs. You have no right not to do that. So we are going to compel you to engage in that activity against your profound religious belief.
We're not going to agree on the merits of this legislation But I do think that what's important to note in this conversation is what we see is this is going to create a huge, an additional lengthy legal battle that we have to go through, that we've seen take place over many, many years when we're trying to basically decide the rights of millions of people in this country based on the legal argument. And I just want to note that that is a failing strategy. Because we're going to get us in a position where we have to legislate, we have to fight through all of our rights through the courts.
Only because we're down to our last 70 seconds.
Sure.
Each of you can talk for 30 seconds, please, about the reaction of corporate America. Corporate America's reaction, to the extent that we can generalize, strikingly in favor of the LGBT community.
I will say this quickly. I think that it's not, we saw this happen last year. It's not surprising. I think the corporations understand that even looking at pride celebrations, there's a lot of money in the LGBT community. My concern is that we're relying on corporations to advocate for our rights.
There's a classical fallacy called mistaking the question. This is a classical issue of mistaking the question. Here's what I'd ask all of them. I'd ask the folks at Coca-Cola, and I'd ask you, do you think the government should be able to force a Baptist clergyman to officiate over same-sex marriage? Yes,
I don't think that that's what the Supreme Court said. That's not what any of the laws have said.
Do you believe the government?
That's not what the Supreme Court said.
Just to make it local, because we're down to our last 20 seconds. In the District of Columbia, it's called something like the Marriage Protection, the Religious Protection and Equal Marriage Act, because it does, at least in the district, takes religious protection. Head on. Angela, Terry, thank you very much. Back with more right after this.